Trump always had this very strong attachment to Israel, as did every president, really, for decades, certainly following Biden's lead. It's very surprising in the sense that one thinks of Trump as being a complete break with Biden, but there's never a complete break. And on the issue of Israel, the policy isn't that much different. On Ukraine and Russia, it's different, very different. And the tone is different. Much of the policy is different, too. But with the Middle East, there's not that much change. It's basically the same policy. And what you've had is this extraordinarily aggressive Israeli action, murderous in the case of Gaza, killing vast numbers of people. I believe several months ago, maybe a year ago, the British journal Lancet estimated close to 200,000 people have been killed in Gaza. That's close to 10% of the entire population. It's very interesting. The Ministry of Health of Gaza puts out figures that undoubtedly are understatements of the number of deaths. But in any case, the United States, in spite of this, is backing Israel to the hilt, as Joseph Biden was doing. Public support for Israel is continuing to go down in the United States and massively worldwide, but the policy remains rock solid and unchanged. And it's based upon decades of decision-making predicated on the assumption that Israel is an unshakable U.S. ally. And the United States will support anything Israel does, almost without question. And we're now seeing the consequences of it. One of the consequences is the Arab street, as they sometimes say, or even the Muslim street going beyond the Arab countries, is incensed by what is going on in Gaza. The whole world is to a significant degree, but naturally, of course, it's greater in Arab and Muslim countries than elsewhere. And but there isn't any real armed opposition to what Israel is doing to any significant extent, except for any real solidarity with the Palestinians in terms of material support. The only major exception is the Houthis. The Houthis, effectively, they control most of Yemen. The US doesn't recognize them, so they're referred to as a Houthi militia. They're effectively the governing body, really, of Yemen for the most part. I think it's only about 20% of the country they don't control at this point. But in any case, even though Yemen is a very poor country, they seem to have developed some significant technological capability with homegrown missiles, which they've been using to interdict shipping between Israel and the Indian Ocean. And they've been firing these missiles to punish Israel, basically, for what it's doing to the Palestinians. The Israelis have always wanted to shut this down. And the Houthis had agreed to a pause in their missile attacks on shipping in the Red Sea because of the Trump-imposed ceasefire. That everyone was very impressed with the ceasefire. I was myself. But basically, Israel decided to start violating the ceasefire quite brazenly with new attacks in Gaza, with hundreds of deaths just recently in recent days. And Trump basically endorsed Israel's violation of the ceasefire, going back to unquestioned U.S. support. It looked as if there might be some Trumpian independence from Israel, but that seems to have been short-lived. And we're back to the old policy of just backstopping Israel no matter what. And so the Houthis announced they're going to resume their attacks on shipping. And so the Trump administration announced airstrikes against the Houthis to attack I assume the logic is to attack the missile launching sites. Those probably would be difficult to attack because I assume they're very dispersed around the country. Not as if they have a giant missile base you could attack. It's not like that. But all the same, Trump adopted a very belligerent policy on behalf of Israel. And the danger here is that this could produce a war with Iran. Iran has been loosely supporting the Houthis, although they far from control them. They've not supplied the missiles. Those seem to have been homegrown, developed in Yemen. But nevertheless, the Trump administration has been using very bellicose rhetoric toward the Iranians, threatening them in all sorts of ways. They're no doubt egged on by the Netanyahu government, who has wanted for decades nothing more. They've wanted nothing more than the U.S. to go to war with Iran. And do to Iran what Israel is not capable of doing, which is destroying the entirety of Iran's nuclear capability. I'm not sure even the U.S. has enough aircraft to achieve that objective, but that's what Israel wants the U.S. to do. And so I'm sure Netanyahu is delighted with the fact that this could produce a war between the U.S. and Iran. Naturally, for the U.S. and for Trump and for the rest of the world, this would be a catastrophe. But nevertheless, for the moment, Netanyahu seems to be getting his way. Things are moving in his direction. And it's all very alarming because this could destabilize the whole region and the world.
You mentioned the situation, the difference between the conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East in the eyes of the Trump administration. What is that difference, in your opinion, that makes the new administration, the Trump administration, so much different from the way they're behaving in the Middle East, comparing that one to the conflict in Ukraine, which he's trying to put an end to the conflict?
He does seem to be trying to put an end to the conflict, and I think that's all the indications are that things are moving in the direction of shutting down the Ukraine war in one way or another. I think that Trump has two motives here. One is that Russia is flat out winning on the battlefield in a way that is irretrievable, and there's nothing the United States or Europe can do to stop a Russian victory. It's simply tilted far too much in Russia's favor at this point. And the U.S. has no cards left to play, neither does Europe. Despite the bellicose rhetoric coming from people like Macron and Starmer, the Europeans can't do anything either. I think Trump realizes this, and he realizes that one way or the other, this war is a loser. And since it is early in his administration, he can end the war, and it won't be his war, it'll be Biden's war. He likes the partisan aspect, of course. Whereas if he prolongs the war and it goes on for much, he will then own the war and own the defeat. And he wants to avoid that scenario. From his standpoint, of course, that makes perfect sense. I think there's a deeper issue, which is a general point. I think Trump has never been really that enthusiastic about new overseas interventions. And I think it's very, very unlikely he would have started the States. It was very much provoked by the United States. But I don't think Trump would have done that had he been in office. Trump is obviously a very unstable, unreliable character, but I think he genuinely is not a fan, is not thrilled about the idea of new wars. I think one of the indicators of that is that in his first term, it is true that he did not start any new wars. He did a lot of very negative things on the international level, but starting new wars was not one of them. And that was very definitely different from previous administrations and certainly from the Biden administration. And in 2024, he emphasized as a campaign point that he did not start any new wars. He was proud of that fact. And so I think that an instinctive aversion to starting new wars, recognizing how risky and dangerous they are, how badly they go in many cases in the real world, Iraq, for example, and unwillingness to own a defeat was why he decided to move against further war in Ukraine. Now, the Middle East is very different because not only is this longstanding U.S. commitment to Israel based upon a lot of irrationalism, I would say, but also I think there's something else, which is a party aspect. The Republicans are much more pro-Israel at this point than the Democrats are. Public opinion polls clearly show this. It's particularly true among the vast number of evangelical Christians, who are one of the strongest bases of support for Trump. Evangelicals are steadfast in their support for Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. In many ways, they seem even more steadfast in their support of Israel than many Jews. Jews are divided on this. I think evangelical Christians, not so much. And there are a lot more of them, a lot more evangelicals than there are Jews. And so this is a big factor, I think, in Trump. Plus, there's campaign contributions. There's the Adelson family. Sheldon Adelson, who died, but now his widow, Miriam Adelson, have given vast sums of money to the Republicans. And they're particularly close to Trump himself, and they are diehard supporters of Israel. And so I just think the politics of it is such that it'd be very difficult for Trump to break with Israel. The Israel lobby, as it's called, does have influence. It has influence in both parties, but I'd say, if anything, even more influential in the Republicans these days than the Democratic Party. And the Democrats did everything Israel wanted, and I think that Trump feels some need to do that as well. There have been some indications he's sometimes having second thoughts. Famously, he posted a video of Jeffrey Sachs, who I think you've had on your show here, who's a famous critic of Israel and U.S. support for Israel, in which Jeffrey Sachs was severely disparaging Netanyahu in strong terms, and Trump pretty much endorsed what Sachs said, and that anticipated the U.S. insistence on the ceasefire. And a lot of people like me wonder, gee, I wonder if Trump actually is going to show an anti-war streak in this conflict as well. But as I said, it was short-lived. It does not seem to be sustained. I don't think Trump has the stomach to go up against the Israel lobby at this point. And so I think the risk is that this could expand the war and get the U.S. involved even further in the war, and very possibly with the war with Iran. I think that's unlikely, but certainly possible.
What is so amazing to me that how the neocons, the people who are in charge in Washington, doesn't matter you have a Republican or Democrat in office.
No.
How do they benefit from this endless chaos in the Middle East? Is that all about the Israeli lobby, or is something beyond that they feel? We know that, for instance, you have Russophobia, which the United States didn't benefit from that.
No, it didn't.
But the same thing in the Middle East. What is in their mind, in your opinion, that they're thinking that they would benefit from this sort of chaos in the Middle East?
It's an interesting question. The neocons, I think I touched on it briefly last time I was on your show, but maybe to expand a little bit, they achieved prominence. They grew up as an idea in the late 1970s, mid to late 1970s. It was predicated on a kind of foreign policy interventionist militarist extremism with no negotiations. And I think the model of what they saw of what America should be was Israel. Why Israel? Because the Israelis are highly militaristic. They don't defend, they attack. And at least in the imagination of the neocons, this isn't really true in practice, but in the imagination of the neocons, they're very efficient. And they defeat their enemies decisively. Decisive victory is what the Israelis do, at least according to the lore anyway. They don't always achieve decisive victory, but the image the neocons have had and have promoted of Israel is they do decisive victory. And America has been too weak in the past. That was their whole idea. That's why America was defeated in Vietnam. They contrasted Israel's successful war in 1967 against 3 Arab states with America's defeat in Vietnam, and said that the U.S. needs to adopt some of the Israeli spirit, some of the Israeli model of what America should be was based upon this conception of Israel. And they were very heavily backed by vested interests, notably what Eisenhower termed the military-industrial complex. They're heavily funded by these groups. And they gradually achieved more and more influence in the foreign policy establishment until, I would say, by the 90s, they were almost unchallenged. Well, I would say in the last 25 years, they've achieved almost unchallenged status in the foreign policy establishment, and that it was almost very difficult to be in the foreign policy establishment as a member in good standing if you were not really a neocon. I mean, they achieved that much influence. And you have a few outliers, like people like Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer, who are very establishment figures, but they're not consulted these days. You don't see them in the New York Times. You don't see them at the White House. And so I think that's the general picture we've had, is that it's not just the Israel lobby, but the Israeli idea has insinuated itself into the whole foreign policy establishment. And so now Trump, on the other hand, has been very hostile to the foreign policy establishment and vice versa. But still he's appointed figures to his cabinet whose views aren't that different from the neocons, in particular Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who has a very warlike position, both in the Middle East and also, at least before he entered office, on Ukraine. And so I've been surprised, really, that Marco Rubio has largely come around to a more Trumpian viewpoint, because that was not what he said when he was in the Senate. On the other hand, you have people who are very anti-war in the Trump presidency, notably Tulsi Gabbard, a former congresswoman from Hawaii, who was a former Democrat, actually a very left-wing Democrat. She was a Bernie Sanders supporter before she broke with the Democrats and went into the Trump administration. She's very anti-war. But nevertheless, despite all this, even the anti-war figures like Tulsi Gabbard, for some reason, they make an exception for Israel. And Gabbard has very strong criticisms of what she calls the war machine, the military-industrial complex, the warmongers. She's repeatedly railed against people like that, but she makes an exception for Israel. Why she does, I don't know. You'll have to ask her that question. It seems like a very big lacuna in her thinking. But the Israel idea is so broad, it even extends to people who are on hostile terms with the foreign policy establishment and the neocon ideology. And it seems to be pretty much ubiquitous in the Trump administration. Now, there are people on the fringes of the Trump entourage. Tucker Carlson, for example, a very conservative talk show host who has a much more consistent anti-war position, and he has been very critical of Israel and U.S. support for Israel. And I should add that Trump's ideology of America first would seem to be inconsistent, because after all, the United States has been giving billions of dollars to Israel every year. I mean, Trump opposes foreign aid. The biggest recipient of foreign aid is Israel, has been for 50 years. And it's a high-income country. The U.S. has poured massive amounts of money into Israel, especially in this recent war. And so there is this inconsistency between America first, on the one hand. Let's not subsidize the foreigners. That's been one of Trump's main themes. On the other hand, he makes an exception for Israel. How long that contradiction will last, I don't know. But it seems to be the basis of his foreign policy in the Middle East, which is Israel is the big exception to everything Trump is saying.
When you look at the face of the Middle East right now and compare it to what it was during the first administration, Trump 1.0 and right now, and do you see any sort of difference? Is that, if so, is that substantial to be taken into the consideration by the Trump administration when it comes to defining the policy in the Middle East?
In the first Trump administration, he was very strongly pro-Israel. He didn't do anything to challenge U.S. aid to Israel. He moved the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, breaking with decades of precedent that the U.S. didn't want to offend Arab nations too much by having an embassy in Jerusalem. So they had it in Tel Aviv, but Trump moved it to Jerusalem. Trump helped broker the Abraham Accords between Israel and several smaller Gulf states, that they would recognize Israel and just ignore the Palestinian issue completely. It looked like before the October 7th terrorist attacks in Israel that Saudi Arabia was going to get on board with the Abraham Accords, or at least that was a possibility. That's been scuttled, of course. So Trump, you could say, was staunchly pro-Israel in his first term. Again, the America First policy that he enunciated simply didn't apply in the case of Israel. And that's a consistency between Trump 1 and Trump 2.
I'm talking about the Middle East. I'm talking about Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Arab states together with Iran and Turkey. Do you see those countries the same way that as they were during his first administration, or the dynamic, the interactions have been changed, the communications have been changed?
I'm sure it's been changed very significantly by the Israeli wars. It's not just in Gaza, of course, but there's Israel has had massive repression in the West Bank, accelerated repression and confrontation of the West Bank. Of course, it's had numerous attacks on Lebanon, attacks on Syria. So there just seems to be a generalized Israeli militarization of the whole region and an Israeli aggressiveness towards the whole region that's unrelenting. And Arab nations can't just ignore this. Maybe they would like to, but their publics, I think, would not allow them to fully ignore this. Saudi Arabia couldn't possibly give diplomatic recognition to Israel at this point, given everything that Israel is doing. That part of the project, I think, has been scuttled for at least the time being. And of course, Turkey had very, positive relations with Israel, certainly business-like relations, and now Turkey's turned much more hostile. Well, they seem to have collaborated on the overthrow of Assad, but despite that, I think, Erdogan can't countenance what Israel is doing in Gaza, the mass slaughter. He can't countenance that. And so I think all of those variables mean that the Arab world is not only going to be much more hostile to Israel, but much more hostile to the United States. It's going to accelerate, and is accelerating, the move towards multipolarity, the decline of U.S. hegemony, which was inevitable. It was inevitable U.S. hegemony would decline. But this new set of wars in the Middle East and the war in Ukraine as put its foot on the gas pedal, you might say, and accelerated the whole project.
And when it comes to the Middle East, who's mattered the most? Which country matters the most to the United States foreign policy? I'm not talking about being the enemy of the friend, and whatever would that be, the definition would that be, but who's the most important, or which country is the most important country for the United States, for the foreign policy of the United States?
Well, there's several contenders, but the number one country would have to be Saudi Arabia. because not only, of course, I think to date, it's still the largest energy reserves in the world with oil reserves. But I think even more importantly is a long history of Saudi Arabia backstopping the dollar. Beginning in the 1970s under the end of the Nixon presidency, a deal was cut whereby Saudi Arabia would use its oil surpluses to purchase American Treasury bonds and shore up the dollar as the world's international currency. And that's been such an important role for them that America does see them as a key player, not just militarily or even religiously. Of course, it's the center of Mecca, Medina, and so on, but also financially, it's very important. Egypt is very important, obviously, because the peace with Israel. I believe after Israel, it's the second biggest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, essentially as a bribe to maintain its peaceful relationship with Israel. And of course, Turkey is a member of NATO, a key member of NATO. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it has the largest military of any NATO country except the United States at this time. So, there are a number of contenders for which are the most important. And all of these have simultaneously become more and more alienated from the United States since the October 7th terrorist attacks and the U.S. support for Israel after that.
Do you see the Trump administration capable of convincing Saudi Arabia, participating physically? I'm talking about fighting Yemenis right now. We know that they had some sort of coalition in fighting Yemenis and Ansarullah for a decade.
Yeah,
but
right.
How is that going to play out right now? Are they going to get along? Are they going to do the same if Donald Trump puts pressure on them?
The Saudis had a very brutal war they had launched several years ago in Yemen against the Houthis, unsuccessful militarily, but killing hundreds of thousands of people and doing it with U.S. and European support. But as I said, they largely disengaged from that war after lack of success. And at this time, politically, I think it would be unlikely that they would turn against the Houthis for this reason. That would be seen as a pro-Israel move, that the Houthis are the only entity in the Arab world that is militarily opposing what Israel is doing. No one else is doing that. The Houthis seem to be standing up for Arab nationalism. And even though they're Shiite, I would imagine that, well, they're not Arab, I guess, technically, but they're Muslim. And so they're standing up, basically, for the Palestinians and implicitly for the honor of the whole Muslim world. I think they're widely seen that way by many Muslims around the world. So it would be very difficult for the Saudis now to start bombing the very people who are opposing what Israel is doing in Gaza and elsewhere. It would just be a terrible look for Saudi Arabia. So I think that's an unlikely scenario. No doubt the Israelis and the Americans would love that to happen, but I don't think that's very likely.
Do you think that Houthis are doing this to Israel because of Iran? Iran is ordering them to do that, or they're doing it by themselves?
But by themselves. I mean, even the Trump administration has acknowledged Iran. They have good relations with Iran. Iran gives them some support, but by no means does Iran control them. It would seem that what the Houthis are doing, this is something they are doing by themselves with weapons they've developed by themselves. I have to say I'm astonished they've been able to develop these types of weapons on their own in what is a very poor country. But they have, and it suggests there's a certain democratization of war going on. And they've had some effectiveness, which is why the United States seems so willing to bomb them, despite the risks.
How do you see the role of the United Kingdom, the British government? Whatever the United States decides to do in the Middle East, they're willing to cooperate with the United States. At the same time, they're saying that we want to do whatever we can for the Gazans, for the Palestinians. But you don't see that sort of attitude, that sort of mindset being interpreted in their actions.
Britain, of course, has been America's loyal ally. Someone calls it America's loyal poodle. And it has a long history of very little independence in foreign policy, certainly in recent decades. I'm not aware of, I haven't seen what Britain's official statement is with regard to the U.S. attacks against the Houthis. As far as I know,
they have been participating in the attack.
Okay, all right, I missed that.
They have the fighter jets coming from Cyprus. Yeah.
All right. Well, in that case, yeah, that fits a long-standing pattern. The Britons do whatever the Americans are doing is what the British are doing. I think the way they see it, is that this enables them to retain some of the luster of being a major power. The phrase they use, they punch above their weight in international relations because of their relationship with the Americans. It gives them a certain prestige. The risks everybody is taking, including the British, obviously, is, well, first of all, war with Iran, but I think more immediately, terrorist attacks. I've been very surprised that there haven't been terrorist attacks against, for example, American targets. I'm happy about that, obviously, since I am an American. I obviously look forward to violence in my own country, but just looking at it coldly, given what Israel has been doing and given American support and British support for it, in the case, for example, of Yemen, I'm just surprised we haven't seen retaliatory terrorism in the United States and possibly also in Britain. But that's a risk they're taking. Obviously, if they are able to destroy all the missiles that the Yemenis have and kill a lot of people in the process, which they're already doing, the Yemenis could start doing things like engaging in classic terrorism on American territory or British territory. People forget that one of the major reasons we had the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001, Al-Qaeda opposition to American support for Israel. I mean, there are other reasons too, presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia, but American support for Israel was clearly a big factor in that. So Israel, by all indications, Israel is a tremendous negative for American security. And there are all sorts of risks being taken. The support America is giving Israel is coming at the expense of American security, and the British are taking exactly the same risk to the extent that they associate themselves with that policy.
What's so amazing that Donald Trump, in one of his recent interviews on CNN with Anderson Cooper, he said that Islam hates us, and we have to find out what's the reason. Why is it so difficult for him to understand what's going on between the United States and Muslim countries? We're talking Iraq, Afghanistan, and you see right now Yemen, and they're talking about immigrants coming to Europe. They don't talk about the way that they were behaving in that region, in Syria. And why is that so difficult to understand what the feeling that he's talking about? I don't say that would be a hatred, but it's a strong feeling toward the United States.
Hatreds, I don't really think terrorism is obviously never justifiable, but it's understandable, it's comprehensible as following a certain logic. It's the weapon of the weak, a weapon of people. In the case of Israel, of course, the whole Arab world feels they have grievances over this. They feel affected by it. And so I think that there's a certain sense in Trump that basically that Israel, there's an identification of Americans with Israel. Israel is more like us. That's the idea. Israel has always presented itself as kind of a outpost of European civilization in this sea of, I don't know, for Arab barbarism. That's the kind of thing they would say. They wouldn't quite say that publicly because that just sounds too ugly, but that is the implication of what they're saying. And there is a presentation of this that has some effectiveness. I mean, it is, even now, public support for Israel has been declining. Polls show that, but there's still significant public support out there. And it reflects, I think, well, decades of propaganda, clearly that, but it also reflects the notion that Israel's like us. Israel is, the Arabs are not like us, but Israel is like us. The Palestinians are not like us. There is a lack of a kind of common humanity that we're all human beings, but some human beings, I guess, are more deserving than others in the logic of this thinking. And Trump, I'm sure that's the way he looks at it. I have no doubt that that's the way Trump looks at it. And, he's expressing it quite clearly. In this case, I don't think he's lying at all.
Today, he talked with Vladimir Putin, and he said it was positive, the way that they were talking. For 2.5 hours, they were talking to each other, considering the conflict in Ukraine. Do you think that Donald Trump would be able to convince Vladimir Putin if he wants to get something for Ukraine, or the you don't see Donald Trump going in that direction. He doesn't care about Ukraine. He wants something else from Vladimir Putin.
I think what he wants more than anything else is to stop a war before it becomes his war. He recognizes the defeat is coming, and he doesn't want it to be his defeat. I think that's his main objective here. I don't think there's going to be any realistic possibility of getting a lot of the minerals, just because a lot of them are under Russian control. He might be trying to get some sort of improved business deals with Russia, restoring some of the economic relationships that have been severed by sanctions. I'm sure that will be part of his agenda, because that's always part of his agenda. I think mostly what he's doing is he's being realistic in Ukraine. And I think people who are worried about nuclear war, as I am, would have to see what he's doing as more positive than what was happening before. And the claim is that, well, he's giving these things away to Putin. He's favoring Putin. He's taking land away from Ukraine. The fact of the matter is, Ukraine is losing on the battlefield. When you're losing on the battlefield, you really can't. You're not in a strong negotiating position. And so this is going to be tilted. I don't know what the final peace agreement will look like. I have no idea. But I do know it's going to be tilted in Russia's favor, because that just reflects the fact that Ukraine is losing and Russia is winning. Now, I should add, this is all very tragic, because all of this could have been prevented through negotiation. There were the Istanbul negotiations that were occurring just 2 months into the war. The U.S. and Britain sabotaged that. We now know that with certainty. There were Russian proposals, basically, that they would settle for just regional autonomy for the Donbass and no NATO in Ukraine, and the U.S. absolutely refused no NATO in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians refused to allow regional autonomy for the Donbass. And so there are multiple things that could have been done that could have prevented the huge number of deaths that have occurred, all the hundreds of thousands of dead bodies. But those dead bodies cannot be brought back. And so the best we can do now is to arrest the suffering and stop the suffering from getting any worse. And if Trump can achieve that, then I think that's a positive thing. I think it's a certainty it's going to stop one way or the other. And some kind of diplomatic settlement is better than an outright military victory. So if Trump can do that, good for him.
The U.S. Treasury Secretary, he's talking about the new policies with considering the sanctions of the United States, sanctions that the United States put on other countries. It seems that the Trump administration is understanding that what's going on in terms of somehow we can call it an economic war or economic conflict between the United States and Russia, between the United States and China. It seems that they're feeling that if they go after the policy of sanctioning other countries, they're going to lose in a long run. But how capable are they in terms of changing this policy, which they're so accustomed for many years?
I'm assuming that the sanctions against Russia will be alleviated to some degree or lifted outright, maybe lifted in phases, simply because they haven't worked. They've been a complete failure. Russia's economy is growing faster than that of most countries in Europe, and it seems to have handled them very well. Trump, on the other hand, is a very big fan of tariffs. We've seen that. I'm skeptical he'll keep them long term, because they'll probably raise prices, and I don't think that'll be very good for him politically, but at least initially he seems to be very favorable on tariffs. He seems to want to increase sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela, presumably with the aim of overthrowing those countries, which is going to be terrible for the people who live in those countries, but nevertheless, he's doing that. So in a lot of ways, he's very bellicose. Obviously, he is I think he has an instinctive hostility towards China. That seems pretty clear. Yet it's also, sometimes he can say things that really sound astonishing in terms of how reasonable they are. Again, whether they'll follow through or not, I don't know. I mean, again, the thing that I focus on, that I'm hopeful about, is the statement he made at one point a few weeks ago, that one of the things he wants to do is meet not just with Putin, but with Xi, and work out a three-way arrangement to cut military spending by 50%, with a focus on nuclear weapons. Now, I have no idea if he's going to do that, and I certainly wouldn't bet on it. But if he does do that, or anything close to it, that would be a remarkable achievement. And it does suggest that there are some understanding on Trump's part that war and military spending is an enormous drain. Not only is it risky in terms of it gets people killed or risks getting people killed, but it's also an enormous drain on the economy and lowers living standards. And I think there's some instinctive understanding of by Trump of that. During the election, when he was, the Cheney family famously endorsed Kamala Harris, and he was scathingly referring to Liz Cheney as a war hawk, a radical war hawk, he called her, with the implication that's a bad thing, and that maybe he won't be a war hawk. Well, he's certainly not a man of peace. We're seeing that in the Middle East. But on Ukraine, he does seem to be following policies that aim to settle this matter through negotiation in a way that Biden and Harris never would have done. And, there were no negotiations. It was in some ways, it was a very extremist policy under the Democrats of no high-level contacts of any sort whatsoever, of a sort that went way beyond anything ever done during the Cold War. It never got to this level of shutting down the whole diplomatic process completely almost during the Cold War. It never got that bad under Reagan. Trump does seem to be reversing that in Ukraine. Although, again, he's following a very opposite policy in the Middle East. So there's contradictions here.
Just to wrap up this session, David, do you think that right now, the second time that Donald Trump is talking with Vladimir Putin on phone, and the first time was 90 minutes, an hour and a half, and right now 2 hours and a half, two and a half hours. And where is the European Union or the European countries in his calculation? Is he getting to the point that we can say he can convince the European countries with his plan on Ukraine?
I'm not sure the European countries are that important at this point. They're just not that important. There's no way they can keep the war going without the Americans. The French and the British idea of sending in troops into Ukraine, there isn't I don't think there's the slightest possibility of that happening. They admit they would need U.S. air support to do that, and the U.S. has given no indication they're going to provide this air support. The number of troops they could field would be very small. The figure I keep hearing is maybe 20,000 troops. We're talking about armies here in the hundreds of thousands, so it would be a drop in the bucket. The Russians would never allow it. So I think what they're trying to do is you're getting people like Macron and Starmer who are deeply unpopular with their own publics, who have no credibility with their own electorate, and they're just trying to sound tough. Because I think basically they have there's no other way of gaining popularity. And so I think there's a real fear in the European Union and in Britain that if this war is lost, as it's inevitably going to be lost, they'll have a lot of explaining to do with their own populations. Here, for 3 years, they've been pouring huge amounts of money into this war with the logic that we could defeat Russia, that living standards have been lowered by increase in oil and food prices, particularly in Germany due to the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline. And it's been having a very negative effect on European standards of living. And they're going to lose the war anyway. And so the public would then say, so we did all this, we lowered our living standards, we wasted all this money, and for what exactly? And what kind of leadership does that suggest we have here? It could be very damaging in the way the loss of the war in Vietnam was hugely damaging to the United States. We had what was called the credibility gap. The public just didn't trust the government anymore. It went on for years, decades in some respects. I suspect in Europe in particular, and to some extent in the US, you're going to get a credibility gap. The people who made this war will look very bad. And it wasn't just specific individuals like Macron, Starmer, or Boris Johnson, but the whole political establishment, virtually the whole range of parties, with very few exceptions, supported the war. They're all going to basically be very damaged by the outcome here. And so I think the effort basically of the Europeans to try and look tough is a way of masking their irrelevance, because they really are irrelevant to the final settlement. I don't think it's going to matter what they say.